If you have this book that you should have received with your documents, you can see the phonetic symbols on the first page. I'm sure you're familiar with this. And this tells us the symbols we use for the vowels. Just let's quickly run through the vowel sounds, all 20 of them. We've got A as in kit, bid, A as in dress, bed, A as in tramp, bad, O as in lock, odd, R as in struck, bud, O as in foot, good. Then we've got E as in fleece, C, A as in face, day, I as in price, try, O as in choice, boy, U as in goose and two, O as in goat, show, A as in mouth, now, ear as in ear, hair as in square, fair, arm as in start, father, four as in thought, law, word as in poor jury, as in nurse, and then the weak vowels. Let's now have a look at today's handout. The first point on that concerns the question of vowel notation, because over the years there's been considerable hesitation, to some extent, about how to represent certain differences of vowels. We can see this by considering the question of how we write the vowels in the words read and rid, respectively. Now, everybody agrees that we have to have a different way of showing these two vowels, because E and I are distinct vowels in contrast with one another in all native accents of English. The precise nature of the contrast may vary a bit from one type of accent to another, but everybody makes some sort of distinction between green, the colour, grin, kind of smile, between read that we have here, or the other kind of read a book, and rid, and between other similar pairs, beat, it, and bit, piece. In many of the classical works by Daniel Jones, my illustrious predecessor, these distinctions are shown principally by the use of length marks. We identify the long vowel, E, read, and we mark it with two dots in length. And we call the other member of the pair, the id, rid, the corresponding short vowel, and we can write it in the same way, but without length marks. Now, this is the first of the three notations listed on your handout, where it says quantitative. This notation is called quantitative because it depends upon quantity, that is length, as a crucial factor. This is used by Daniel Jones in his outline of English phonetics, and in the first 12 editions of his English pronouncing diction, very influential. It has virtually been abandoned now in books on English phonetics published in Europe. Certainly it's no longer in use in the United Kingdom. On the other hand, it persists, for example, in the People's Republic of China, it's still the usual notation system. Why has this been abandoned? Well, very largely because it ignores the very important quality differences. And plenty of tests have shown that if you expose listeners to tests which require them to respond either to length, duration, or to quality, they respond preferentially to quality. You can mess around with the duration, and it doesn't matter all that much, but if you mess around with the quality, they will make different identifications. That is, if you play a long read to them, that's heard as read, the short vowel. If you play a rather short read to them, that's interpreted as the long vowel. So for the listener, the native speaker at any rate, length, duration, is not the principal factor. Furthermore, as we shall see later, there are important factors in the phonetic environment, the surrounding sounds, which cause considerable perturbations in duration, but don't affect quality. So from 60, 70 years ago, there's always been another tradition which symbolizes, in the phonetic symbols, symbolizes principally the quality differences and perhaps ignores the length differences. Now this is the second type of notation shown on our handout, where it's labeled qualitative because it emphasizes quality, color, quality. Here we use one symbol for the E in read, the ordinary letter I with a dot on it, and we use a different special symbol for the vowel in rid. We nowadays normally use the small capital I. This is found also in works by Ladefoged and Abercrombie, for example. They make use of in some of their works, a generator of a differently shaped special letter, but the point is there's a special letter, a short vowel, as opposed to the long vowel. So we have the curly iota pi. But the point remains the same, that we concentrate on the quality difference, and quality difference, and we forget about the duration difference. Right, up to about 1960, we had these two different traditions, and people complained a great deal about them because, for example, the letter I on its own meant a different thing, depending on whether you were using a quantitative or a qualitative transcription. When I first started as a junior lecturer in the Department of Phonetics and Linguistics, I had, in fact, to be able to manipulate a number of different transcription systems appropriate for different classes. Because with our overseas students we used a quantitative notation, but with our native speakers, about quantitative, we used a qualitative notation. Well, Gimson resolved to end this confusion by producing a transcription that combined elements of both. And his transcription is the one that we now use, and it's been very successful because his transcription is both quantitative and qualitative, and it redundantly makes use of two ways of showing the information, because it does use the length mark in read, but it also uses a special letter shape, the ordinary letter I in read and the small capital I in read. Now, I say this is redundant, admittedly, but it has its advantages because it draws our explicit attention to both of the factors that distinguish vowels in such pairs. So we write the ordinary letter I with the length mark in read, and the special letter I without the length mark in read. I think the first person to popularise this was clearly Gimson. Whether he actually invented it is another question, because it also appeared very early in the Longman Dictionary of Contemporary English, for example. It's been adopted by all recent writers on English phonetics, at least those who are aiming towards the speakers of English as a foreign language, so including Peter Roach in his English phonetics and phonology, and including myself in the Longman Pronunciation Dictionary, and Gimson, and following him Roach, have also applied it in the more recent editions of English Pronunciation. So, I'm a supporter of this double notation that is both quantitative and qualitative. And it has not just a convenience, but also a pedagogical value, because it reminds the user of both the factors. And it's also visually helpful because instead of having to concentrate with your eyes on one particular subtle detail, you've got two different details. So we use the notation shown in point 2 on the handout, the RB vowels, the strong vowels, which is We can, of course, classify vowel sounds phonetically, and I expect you're familiar with the general classification. We make reference to three factors, mainly. One of these is easy to observe, that's the lip position. Not very important in English, but in some languages it's very important whether the lips are spread or neutral, or whether they're rounded. And in French or in German, for example, Korean, it's very important to make this distinction, because in French and German you have contrasts such as E, U, where the difference depends on the lip position, tongues are in the same position. In Korean you have contrasts like U, again, with lips giving a crucial distinction. But in many other languages, including English, Spanish, Japanese, the vowel quality really determines the lip position, so the lips don't have any independent life of their own, shall we say. Nevertheless, to get the right sound, you probably have to have the lips doing the right thing. The only vowel in modern English received pronunciation for which the lips do anything energetic is or, because in or we do have pretty firm rounding and protrusion of the lips. Sort, sport, short, thought. We do have other vowels that are classified usually traditionally as rounded. Short and odd, as in lot, hot, and so on. Yes, it does have rounding in the lips, but because the jaw is pretty open, there's not very noticeable rounding compared with or. With oo and o, we seem to be changing. These vowels used to be well rounded. People used to say spoon, goose, use, and good, and put. But nowadays people often just don't bother to round their lips. They say spoon, goose, use, good, put. I don't like to say this too loudly in the presence of the Japanese, because many Japanese people use an unrounded vowel, which can sound very odd in English. If you say spoon rather than spoon. I'm very much struck by young people saying, good, 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 where I would probably say good, and my parents would certainly say good. So we're moving away from good towards good. Next thing we have to put aside is short versus long. We have the 6 short strong vowels of received pronunciation English: I, U, F, A, and O. And the remainder are the long vowels and diphthongs. Now, it may be a bit surprising, first of all, that I've put together the long vowels, the long pure vowels, long monophthongs, and the diphthongs. The difference, in principle, is very clear. Long monophthongs remain the same. If you prolong them, you just prolong the same thing. But a diphthong involves a change. The problem is, though, that what we're trying to do is classify phonemes. Phonemes, linguistic units, typically comprise a number of allophones, variants used in particular positions, or indeed stylistic variants. And the distinction between monophthong, non-monophthong, and diphthong is not important in English from this point of view. Because E, for example, we may classify it as a long monophthong, and sometimes it is a long monophthong, E. But perhaps more frequently, it's a little bit diphthongal. E, 1, 2, 3, You have that slight diphthongal quality. E. So, I mean, there would be a good case for writing it, perhaps like that, showing its diphthongal quality. And certainly you can argue that it's really a diphthong. There is one tradition, an American tradition, that writes this kind of vowel like that, and that of course brings out this characteristic very strikingly. Similarly with oo, we could write it as oo, 1, 2, oo, 2, that's 2, So this is the justification for putting the long vowels and diphthongs together, but linguistically the distinction is not important. Indeed, it works the other way around too. The diphthong in words like square, fair, we show it with symbols that imply air, but you have only to listen and you can hear people saying square, fair, sit on a chair, chair. In other words, producing a long monophthong, chair. It doesn't matter whether you say chair, 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 or chair, chair, chair. As speakers of English, we react to both of these things as the same. We're not very sensitive to the difference between chair and chair. And again, this reinforces my general point that the distinction between long vowel and diphthong is not terribly important. Okay, we've got two more dimensions we need to look at, and these relate to the position of the tongue in the mouth. You can consult the textbooks to see cross-sectional diagrams and so on of the tongue position and the theory of cardinal vowels that enables us to relate these to standardized qualities. But we've got basically two dimensions here, one of which concerns how high up in the mouth the tongue is raised, how close it comes to the roof of the mouth, and the other of which depends upon which part of the tongue is highest. Is it the front or the back of the tongue that is closer to the roof of the mouth? Now this gives us our classification in the vertical dimension of high versus mid versus low. Now, there are alternative terms here because instead of high, we can also say close. Please notice that this is pronounced with a voiceless sound at the end. This is the adjective close, as when you say the tongue is close to the roof of the mouth. It's not the word close meaning shut, because there isn't any shutting. Not far away, it's close to the roof of the mouth. Confusing with the opposite, the antonym is open, which is indeed related to shut, so I can understand the confusion. But we can say, therefore, either high or close at one end, and either low or open at the other end. And notice how the jaw gives you a clue about this, because generally the jaw makes a big opening for an open vowel, R, can't, but not much of a movement for a close vowel, it, beat. The other dimension is, as I say, front versus back. We have front vowels like E, back vowels like U. Typically, in many languages, front vowels are thread, back vowels with the lips rounded or sort of. We classify diphthongs both with respect to the starting point and with respect to the ending point. The words at the bottom of my chart refer to the end point of diphthongs, so I put them into groups, in fact, depending on their end points. We've got E, A, I, Oi, which have a high front E area end point. We've got U, O, Ow, which have a high back U area end point. And we've got Ear, Ur, Er, or R, which end in a non-high, that is either a mid or an open position, which seems to me to give the most meaningful classification of the vowels into smaller sections, smaller sets. Well, that's a phonetic classification of vowel quality, vowel length and so on. There's also another way of looking at the vowels in English, which depends upon their linguistic behavior. as reflected also in their spelling. Now, as you know, English spelling really reflects the pronunciation of 500 or 600 years ago or more. And it doesn't show the changes that have taken place since then. Furthermore, it depends upon the relationship of long and short vowels, which was valid in Middle English 600 years ago, but is not really phonetically valid nowadays. Because before the Great Vowel Shift, we had a different set of relationships. The Great Vowel Shift took place 550 years ago, in the early 15th century. It clearly was pronounced table, something like that, in English 700 years ago. But we moved from A to A. We kept the same spelling, and this means that one of the meanings of this letter, and indeed the name of the letter A, is now this diphthong A. But that reflects a change. The German phoneme is Name. Certainly the English phoneme was Name once upon a time. But it changed, it's now name, because of this Great Vowel Shift. Well, before the Great Vowel Shift, there was a simple regular relationship between short A and long A, between short E and long E, between short E and long E. Because of the Great Vowel Shift, the long members of these pairs have changed their quality, so that now the relationship is between a short vowel and a diphthong, in the case of A and A, between short E and long E, which is phonetically rather different, between short E and the diphthong I. And we still use the traditional names. We speak of short A and long A, short E and long E, short I and long I. And this gives us a real problem with the names of the short vowels, because we use a name for the short vowel which is quite different from the sound of it. We say short E, using that sound, but we're referring to A. So there tends to be a big confusion here. You'll be aware that English spelling reflects this relationship, but reflects it imperfectly and in a rather complicated way. With the short vowel, fat, but then we use this doubling of the consonant to remind ourselves that it's still a short vowel in the comparative fatter. Conversely, we use A consonant E to reflect the long vowel, the diphthong in rate, but we drop the E when we add an ending, giving us rate. So that the letter AT on its own sometimes reflects A and sometimes reflects A. This means that there's a real uncertainty. Does this mean A or does it mean A? So we have on the one hand acid, and on the other hand basic. We have on the one hand anger, but on the other hand danger. And we also have inherited certain morphologically related pairs, words that are derivationally related to one another, so that we say humanity, but humane with an A. So this is a quite deep-seated relationship, which native speakers are well aware of, and there are many pairs, indeed, which switch from one to the other as we have some kind of a suffix. Same sort of relationship with the letter E. So we have the short vowel in set, double the consonant letter for setting. Compare complete with a silent E at the end, going into long vowel, dropped when we add ing as in completed. So the letters E, T are, as it were, ambiguous. Ambiguity, devil, evil. So we have these two classes of suffixes, things like ing, which don't affect the vowel quality of the preceding vowel, and things like itty, which typically do affect. Same relationship with the letters I or Y, which is the same meaning. So, for sort of related words, the legal term, a writ, noun, a writ, they're right. The silent E shows us it's the long vowel, the I, right. Written, double T here. Writing, single T. Ambiguity, river, driver. Relationship between typical, type, or derivative to derive. Well, we could go on with this and just briefly look at the other two vowel letters, or examples of the same thing. Short vowel in hop, hopping, diphthong in hope, and hoping. Short vowel in copy, long vowel in opal, precious stone. Short vowel in verbosity, the abstract noun related to verbose. With the letter U, short vowel in cut, double consonant letter for cutting, long vowel which is U, in compute, and computing. Notice that this yod gets dropped after certain consonants, so we typically say pollute, polluting, rather than pollute, polluting, although 100 years ago people perhaps said pollute. Generally speaking, the letter U, given any choice, indicates the long quality, but there are one or two words like pumice, kind of volcanic rock, where it doesn't. Much more typical human, where it does. And notice immunity, both have U, we don't get the relationship that we have between verbose verbosity, we say immunity, just the same quality as immune. Now I think it can be argued that an awareness of whether you ought to use the long vowel or the short vowel is absolutely crucial for being intelligible when you speak English as a foreign language. If you get this wrong, people will just not be able to identify the word. If you say, look at the river instead of the river, they don't know what you're talking about. So, from the point of view of spelling and sound, this is overwhelmingly the biggest problem in English. And I don't really know any simple answer to it. I say, really, apart from these generalizations that we've noticed already, really what you have to do is just learn each word with its pronunciation. Now, so far we've been talking about phonemes. We've been classifying phonemes, we've been choosing one phoneme or another. But what I want to do for the rest of this talk is discuss allophones, that is, discuss variants within each phoneme. Because the notation that we use is a phonemic notation, these distinctions are not shown in our phonetic transcription unless we make special differences, special arrangements to show it. Because what I'm going to talk about is the factors affecting the duration of vowels. We've already noticed one very important factor affecting duration, which is the basic dichotomy between short vowels and long vowels. Now that remains. Everything else being equal, short vowels are shorter than long vowels. In a comparable environment, there is a difference between them. If we go back to read and rid, it is the case that the vowel in read lasts longer than the vowel in rid. And if we put them in the same frame, you can easily measure this. If I say, the word is read, the word is rid, will be that difference read, rid. It doesn't last as long. However, this basic classification is subject to perturbation, interference from factors of the environment. And there are two factors, above all, that I want to draw your attention to today. They're listed on the handout: Pre-Fortis clipping and Rhythmic clipping. If we compare the word feed, I'm going to feed the animals, and feet, what you're going to wear on your feet, socks and shoes. You will notice that they have the same vowel phoneme, which we write in the transcription in the same way, but nevertheless they don't sound quite the same, because the first word is feed, 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 and the second word is feet, feet, feet. The first one is feed, the second one is feet. We have a reduction in duration before the Fortis consonant, before the T sound, feet. In the square brackets, I've given you some possible detailed notations, drawing your attention to the likely devoicing of the D in feed, and the possible glottal reinforcement or replacement of the T in feet, together with the reduced duration, clipped duration of the vowel in feet. The same sort of thing applies to the diphthong I if we compare, on the one hand, rise, rise, and on the other hand, rice, rice, to eat. Again, notice that in rise, where there is a venous consonant at the end, the Z sound, rise. Rice. Rice. Much shorter duration. Now, there's this problem of terminology. I don't want to say short because that might suggest the short vowel. E, not I. E, not E. I don't want to say reduced because we're going to talk later on about vowel reduction in the sense of weakening of vowels, going to schwa to and so on. Gimson uses the word reduced, which I think is misleading, which is why we have for some years now in this department been calling it clipping, as an unambiguous way of referring to the clipped duration. Cut off the end of it. It doesn't last as long. But the quality is unaffected, and the phonemic identity is unaffected. It remains essentially the same vowel. It applies this clipping whenever the following consonant is Fortis. Notice it also applies in the words when we have a suffix or another syllable. So if we compare seating from seat with seeding from seed, we still observe this difference in duration. Seating doesn't last as long as seeding. We get clipping before the T. Racing, we have the clipping of A before the S sound, compared with raising, where we don't have such strong clipping before the Z sound. Doing linguistics is an excellent exercise for the mind because it's like writing a computer program. You have to get it exactly right. And there's a great temptation just to be sort of approximate. Now, so far I've been approximate. I say we get this clipping before a voiceless consonant. Well, yes and no. So we've got a first version of the rule here. When followed by a Fortis consonant, a vowel undergoes clipping. We've noticed these words like seating. What about the E sound in reaping? Do you think that gets clipped or not? Is it, for our present purposes, before this P? Well, there's a problem here about syllables, syllable division, about which different people have different views. But whatever your views, we do have to say that yes, this P does exert a clipping influence on the preceding vowel, just as much as in reap, so in reaping. I can do it by saying, well, it's an morpheme,
Or you can do it by saying, well, actually, the syllabification is such that the P is in the first syllable in English, unlike in some other languages. But we've got to make sure that in reaping we do get clipping. Well, I take the view that it's in the same syllable, so my second version is then to say that the vowel undergoes clipping when followed by one or more Fortis consonants in the same syllable. And notice that we can get the clipping not only of the vowel, but also of intervening sonorants like nasals and liquids, as we notice if we compare build with built. Okay, if I say those in comparable environments, falling tone on their own, build, 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 and built, 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 build, built. So the T exerts an influence not only on the A, but also on the O, compared with the lack of such influence in build. So it gets more and more complicated to actually formulate all this in words. And for the third version, I reverted to one of these nice diagrams where we draw a tree diagram for the syllable, divide the syllable into its onset and its rhyme, the rhyme we divide into its nucleus and coda, the coda we divide into bits and pieces, and we get clipping for the underlined items, that is the nucleus vowel, and the sonorant consonant for its rhyme as built. Well, you can see more examples of Pre-Fortis clipping on page 18 in your booklet. A number of sets of minimal pairs and so on, seat, say, and check through. You can see that we regularly get this clipping before Fortis and voiceless consonant. Okay, that's one influence. The other influence is what we call rhythmic clipping. And this will fall into place automatically once you've got English rhythm well under control. English rhythm depends upon the recurrence of stressed syllables at regular intervals. And the unstressed syllables find their place where they may. So we get a kind of bum, 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 and the unstressed syllables fit in among the stress. This means that if you take a word that has one stress, it's going to occupy something like the same amount of time, no matter how many syllables it has. It means that the word read, the word reader, and the word readership tend to occupy about the same amount of time. What are you going to read is being converted to reader. The newspaper builds up its readership. And the E of the read has to contract in order to make space for the unstressed vowels. Second example, man, manage, management. You can see why the vowel in man can expand, take plenty of space for itself. In manage, it's got to be a bit clipped because of the inch syllable to follow. In management, it's got to be even more clipped. Man, manage, manage. Tend, tender, tenderness. So that the duration of the stressed vowel progressively gets less as progressively more syllables within the same stress. Now, these two different factors, Pre-Fortis clipping and rhythmic clipping, can both operate. And this is why, if we take the word teacher, we have the paradox that a non-vowel, from the point of view of the phoneme classification, actually sounds pretty short. Teacher. I'm a teacher. It sounds wrong if you say, I'm a teacher. No, we can't say teacher. Can't really make it long, teacher. Why not? Well, because of both of these factors. Pre-Fortis clipping, because ch is voiceless, teach. Rhythmic clipping, because we've got an unstressed vowel. teaching it even more, two unstressed vowels before it behaves like vowel and so likewise with the noun use, voiceless Fortis S, useful, usefulness, inusefulness, really very, very short duration because it's doubly flipped. Pre-Fortis flipped because of the voiceless S, rhythmically flipped because of the unstressed S. Right, that's it for this one.